The Madman and the Pirate by R.M. Ballantyne. Chapter 7. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by Arrowit. The Madman and the Pirate. Chapter 7. Strange to say, the anger of the Raturans was not assuaged by the rebuff which they received at that time. They took counsel again, and resolved to wait till the suspicions of the mountain men had been allayed, and then attack them when off their guard. Meanwhile Zeppa, who did not at all concern himself with these matters, took it into his head one day that he would teach his little favourite, Lippy, to sing. Being a religious man, he naturally selected hymns as the foundation of his teaching. At first he found it rather uphill work, for Lippy happened to be gifted with a strong sense of the ludicrous, so that when he took her on his knee, the day on which the idea occurred to him, opened his mouth, and gave forth the first notes of a hymn in a fine sonorous bass voice, the child gazed at him for a few moments in open-eyed wonder, and then burst into an uncontrollable fit of open-mouthed laughter. Poor Zeppa! Till that day, since his mental breakdown, the idea of singing had never once occurred to him, and this reception of his first attempt to teach disconcerted him. He stopped abruptly, and gazed at the child with a perplexed expression. This gaze was evidently regarded by Lippy as an additional touch of humour, for she went off into renewed explosions of delight, and the lesson had to be given up for that time. Zeppa was gifted, however, with patient perseverance in a remarkable degree. He renewed his efforts, but changed his plan. From that time forward he took to humming hymns in a low, sweet voice, as if for his own amusement. In a short time he had the satisfaction of hearing Lippy attempt, of her own accord, to sing one of the hymns that had taken her fancy. She went wrong in one or two notes, however, which gave Zeppa the opportunity of putting her right. He took her on his knee, and told her, in her own tongue, to try it again. "Listen, this is the way," he said, opening his mouth to give an example. But the first note had scarcely begun to sound, when Lippy thrust her brown fist into his mouth and told him to stop. She would sing it herself. Accordingly, she began in a sweet, tiny little voice, and her teacher gazed at her with intense pleasure depicted on his handsome face until she reached the note where she had formerly gone wrong. "No, not so. Sing thus," he said, giving the right notes. The pupil took it up at once, and thus the singing lessons were fairly begun. But the matter did not rest here, for Lippy, proud of her new acquirement, soon began to exhibit her powers to her little companions, and ere long, a few of the smallest of these ventured to creep into Zeppa's hut while the daily lesson was going on. Gradually they grew bolder and joined in the exercise. Zeppa took pleasure in helping them, and at last permitted as many as could crowd into his hut to do so. Those who could not get inside sat on the ground outside, and, as the hut was open in front, the gathering soon increased. Thus, insensibly, without a well-defined intention or effort on the part of anyone, the praise of God and sweet name of Jesus ascended to heaven from that heathen village. The assembling of these children for their lesson brought powerfully to Zeppa's mind one day the meetings of the Ratinga people for worship, and the appropriateness of beginning with prayer occurred to him. Accordingly, that morning, just as he was about to commence the hymns, he clasped his hands, raised his eyes, and briefly asked God's blessing on the work. Profound astonishment kept the little ones quiet, and before they had time to recover, the prayer was over. Zeppa's mode of terminating the assembly was characteristic. He did not like to order the children away, much less to put them out of his hut, and the little creatures, being fond of the teacher, were prone to remain too long. When, therefore, he thought it time to close, he simply rose up and took himself off, leaving his congregation to disperse when and how it pleased. Sometimes, on these occasions, he would remain away for perhaps 2 or 3 days, having totally forgotten the singing class, to the great disappointment of the children. One night, while he was thus absent, the men of Ratura delivered the attack which they had long meditated. It was an unusually dark and still night, such a night as tends almost irresistibly to quiet and subdue wayward spirits, and induces a man to think of his Creator. Such a night as is apt to fill the guilty conscience with unrelenting fears, as though it felt the near approach of that avenging sword which sooner or later it must meet. Nevertheless, unmoved by its influences, except in so far as it suited their dark designs, the Raturans chose it for the fell purpose of invading their neighbours' lands, and exterminating their ancient foes, for, driven to desperation by the taunts and scorns of the Mountain men, they felt that nothing short of extermination would suffice. And they were right. Extermination of the sinners, or the sins, was indeed their only chance of peace. Not knowing the gospel method of blotting out the latter, their one resource lay in obliterating the former. In the dead of night, that darkest hour when deeds of villainy and violence are usually done, the Raturan chief once more assembled his men from all quarters of the rolling plains and dismal swamps, until the entire force of the tribe was under his command. Leaving the aged men and boys to protect the women and children, those dark-skinned warriors marched away to battle, not with the flaunting banners and martial music of civilized men, but with the profound silence and the stealthy tread of the savage. Though the work in hand was the same, the means to the end were different. We will therefore describe them. Had it been a daylight battle to which they went forth, their women and boys would have followed with reserve ammunition in the shape of baskets full of stones, and spare javelins. But, being a night attack, the fighting men went alone, each armed with a heavy club, a light spear, and a stone knife or hatchet. Armed at the pass where they had met with a singular repulse on a former occasion, the main body was halted, and scouts were sent out in advance to see that all was clear. Then the plan of attack was formed. One detachment was to approach the enemy's village on the right, another was to go round to the left, while the main body was to advance in front. There is a proverb relating to the plans of men as well as mice, which receives verification in every land at that time. Its truth received corroboration at this time on Sugarloaf Island. On that same night it chanced that the chief Ongoloo was unable to sleep. He sent for his prime ministerial jester and one of his chiefs, to whom he proposed a ramble. The chief and jester professed themselves charmed with the proposal, although each had been roused from a pleasant slumber. In the course of the ramble they came unexpectedly on one of the Raturan scouts, whom they temporarily extinguished with a club. Ongoloo became at once alive to the situation, and took instant action. "Wapoota!" he said in an excited whisper. "Run to the rear of the foe. Go swiftly like a sea-bird. When you get there yell, shriek, like you know how, as you did last time. Change your ground as each yell, so they will think you a host. Fear not to be captured, your death is nothing. Away!" A kick facilitated Wapoota's flight, and the two chiefs returned at speed to rouse the sleeping camp. Wapoota performed his part nobly, and without being captured, for he did not agree with Ongoloo as to the unimportance of his own death. At the unexpected outcry in the rear, the Raturans halted, and held a hasty council of war. "Let us go back and fight them," said one. "No use, they are evil spirits, not men," said another. Some agreed with the former, some the latter. "While we waste time here," said the leading chief, "the mountain dogs will get ready for us. Come, forward!" The chief was right. Ongoloo's ruse caused delay, so that when the Raturans reached the village they found armed men ready to receive them. These they attacked with great courage, and waged a somewhat scrambling fight until daylight enabled each party to concentrate its forces. Meanwhile, at the first alarm, the women and children of the village had been sent off to the mountains for safety. Among the fugitives were Lippy and her mother. These happened to meet with the enemy's detachment, which had been sent to assault the village on the left. The women scattered and fled. The savage warriors pursued, and several were taken, among them Lippy and her mother, who were promptly dispatched to the rear. Those of the broken band that escaped continued their flight to the hills. They had not gone far when they met Zeppa returning from one of his rambles. His surprise on hearing that the village had been attacked was great, and his anxiety considerable. Although he had refused to go out to war with his entertainers, he felt no disposition to stand idly by when they were attacked. Disordered though his mind was, he could make a clear distinction between aggressive war and self-defence. "And where is Lippy?" he asked, glancing round on the terrified faces. "She is caught and carried away, with her mother." "What?" exclaimed Zeppa, with a flash of his bright eyes that told of natural rage mingling with the fires of insanity. The women did not wait for more. They ran away from him in terror. But Zeppa had heard enough. Turning his face toward the village, he sped over the ground at a pace that soon brought him in sight of the combatants, who seemed to be swaying to and fro, now here, now there, as the tide of battle flowed and victory leaned sometimes to one side, sometimes to the other. Zeppa was unarmed. As he drew near he was observed by both parties to stop abruptly in his career, and wrench out of the ground a stake that had been meant for the corner post of a newly begun hut. It resembled the great club of Hercules rather than a weapon of modern man. Whirling it like a feather round his head, the maniac rushed on. He was thoroughly roused. A feeling of desperate anxiety coupled with a sense of horrible injustice had set its spirit in a blaze. His great size, which became more apparent as he advanced, his flashing eyes, compressed lips, and the wild flowing of his uncut hair and beard, gave him altogether an aspect so terrible that his foes trembled, while his friends rejoiced, and when at last he uttered a roar like a mad bull, and launched himself in the thicket of the fight, the Raturans could not stand it, but turned and fled in a body under the impression that he was more than human. He was too fleet for them, however. Overtaking the flying knot, he brought the corner post down on the mass, and 3 warriors were levelled with the ground. Then, hurling the mighty club away as if it were a mere hindrance to him, he ran straight at the leader of the Raturans, who, being head and shoulders above his fellows, seemed a suitable foe to single out. Before reaching him, however, his attention was arrested by a cry from someone in the midst of the enemy in front. It was the voice of Wapoota, who was trying to break his way through the flying foe to his own people. Fortunately Zeppa recognized the voice, and darted toward his friend, who was hard pressed at the time by a crowd of opponents. One roar from the maniac sent these flying like chaff before the wind. It must be added, however, for the credit of the men of Ratura, that Ongoloo and his warriors had backed up their new leader gallantly. When Wapoota saw his deliverer, he ran to him, panting, and said, "Come with me, this way, Lippy is here." That was sufficient. Zeppa became submissive like a child, while the jester, taking him in hand, ran with him at racing speed in the direction of the Raturan villages, toward which the child and his mother were being led by the party which had captured them. This was briefly explained to Zeppa by Wapoota, who had chanced to encounter the party when returning from his yelling mission, if we may so express it. The race was a long one, but neither the madman nor his friend flagged until they overtook the party. It consisted of about 30 warriors, but if it had been 300, it would have made no difference in the effect of Zeppa's roar and aspect, as he rushed upon them with obviously awful intentions, though without arms. In fact, the latter circumstance tended rather to increase the fears of the superstitious natives. They fled as one man at the first sight of the maniac, and Lippy was recovered. Instantly Zeppa's ferocity vanished, and the tenderest of smiles rippled over his face as he took the child in his arms and kissed her. But Wapoota did not feel quite so easy, for in their mad race they had outstripped the flying enemy, bands of whom were constantly passing them in their flight before the mountain men. His anxieties, however, were groundless, for no sooner did any of the Raturans set eyes on Zeppa than, with howls of consternation, they diverged at a tangent, like hunted hares, and coursed away homeward on the wings of terror. As on former occasions of conquest, the mountain men pursued the flying host into their swamps, but they did not, as in former times, return to slay the aged and carry the women and children into captivity. To the surprise of all his followers, and the anger of not a few, Ongoloo commanded his men to return to their village and leave the Raturans alone. One of his chiefs, who showed a disposition to resist his authority, he promptly knocked down, whereupon the rest became obedient and went quietly home. On reaching the village, Zeppa went straight to his hut with Lippy on his shoulder. Apparently he had forgotten all about the recent fight, for, without even waiting to take food or rest, he sat down, and began to give his little friend a singing lesson. With the air of a little princess, who felt that she was only receiving her due, the child accepted the attention. Her young companions, attracted by the sweet sounds, soon flocked to the old place of rendezvous, and when the last of the straggling warriors returned from the field of battle, they found the singing class going full swing as if nothing had happened. But when the wounded and dead were brought in, other sounds began to arise, sounds of wailing and woe, which soon drowned the hymns of praise. As soon as Zeppa became fully alive to this fact, he ceased singing, and went about trying to comfort those who wept, but, from his perplexed air, and the frequency from which he paused in his wanderings to and fro, and passed his hand across his brow as if to clear away some misty clouds that rested there, it was evident that his shattered intellect had taken in a very imperfect impression of what had occurred. As if to get rid of this beclouded state, he started off that evening at a quick walk toward his favourite haunts among the hills. No one ever followed him on these occasions. The natives regarded his person as in some measure sacred, and would have deemed it not only dangerous but insolent to go up among the rocky heights when the madman was known to be there. Once, indeed, Wapoota, with that presumptuous temerity which is a characteristic of fools in general, ventured, on the strength of old acquaintance, to follow him, and even went toward the well-known cave where he had found refuge and protection in the day of his distress. But Zeppa had either forgotten his former intercourse with the jester, or intended to repudiate the connection, for he did not receive him kindly. On the way up, Wapoota, who felt somewhat timorous about the visit, had made up his mind as to the best mode of address with which to approach his friend. He had decided that, although he was not particularly youthful, the language and manner of a respectful son to a revered father would best befit the occasion. Accordingly, when he reached the cave and saw Zeppa busy beside his fire with a cocoanut, he assumed a stooping attitude of profound respect and drew near. Zeppa looked up with a frown, as if annoyed at the intrusion. "Your unworthy son," began Wapoota, "comes to—" but he got no further. He could not well have hit upon a more unfortunate phrase. "My unworthy son!" shouted Zeppa, leaping up, while unearthly fire seemed to shoot from his distended eyes. "My son! Son! Ha! Ha!" The horrified intruder heard the terminal yell, and saw the maniac bound over the fire toward him, but he saw and heard no more, for his limbs became suddenly endued with something like electric vitality. He turned and shot over a small precipice, as if flung from an ancient catapult. What he alighted on, he did not know, still less did he care. It was sufficiently soft to prevent death. Another awful cry echoed and re-echoed from the heights above, and intensified the electric battery within him. He went down the slopes regardless of gradient, at a pace that might have left even Zeppa behind if he had followed, but Zeppa did not follow. When Wapoota went over the precipice and disappeared, Zeppa halted and stood erect, gazing with a questioning aspect at the sky, and drawing his hand slowly across his brows with that wearied and puzzled aspect which had become characteristic. Returning after a few minutes to his cave, he reseated himself quietly beside his fire, and with his usual placid expression, devoted himself earnestly to his cocoanut. That was the first and last occasion on which the poor madman experienced intrusion from the natives in his mountain retreat. End of Chapter 7.
Chapter 8 of the Madman and the Pirate. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Madman and the Pirate by R.M. Ballantyne. Chapter 8. Let us return now to our miserable and half-hearted pirate, far out upon the raging sea. It must not be supposed that the Pacific Ocean is always peaceful. No, there are days and nights when its winds howl, and its billows roar, and heave and fume with all the violence and fury of any other terrestrial sea. One such night the pirate's bark was tossed like a cork on the Pacific's heaving bosom, while shrieking winds played, as it were, fiendishly with the fluttering shreds of sails which they had previously blown to ribbons. Richard Rosco stood beside the weather bulwarks, holding on to one of the mizzen backstays. His mate Redford assisted the man at the wheel. Upwards of 3 years of Rosco's rule had subdued Redford to the condition of a hypocritical and sly, but by no means a submissive, savage. One or two spurts at the commencement of their career had satisfied the mate, as well as the men, that the only way to overcome Rosco was to take his life; and as Redford had not sufficient courage, and the men no desire, to do that, they pursued their evil courses in comparative harmony. Nevertheless, the pirate captain knew well that the savage Redford was more acceptable to the pirates than himself, so he determined to carry out intentions which had been simmering in his brain for some time, and rid the pirate crew of his presence. "We will sight the island to morrow afternoon, sir, if this holds," said the mate. "I know it," answered Rosco. "There is no good anchorage around it," continued the mate. "So you have told me before," returned the captain; "but it matters not. We shall not anchor." "Not anchor?" repeated Redford in surprise. "I understand that we were to land there to ship sandalwood. The crew thought so too, and I am quite sure—" "Well, go on. What are you sure of?" "Oh, nothing. Only sure that Captain Rosco understands his own intentions best." Rosco made no reply, and nothing further passed between the inharmonious pair at the time. Next day the gale abated, and as Redford had predicted, Sugarloaf Island was sighted in the afternoon. Running close in under the shelter of the mountain, the bark was hove to and a boat lowered. "The crew will take the arms with them, I suppose, sir?" asked the mate. "Of course, though there will not be occasion for them, as there are no natives at this part of the island. I merely wish to ascend the hill to reconnoitre. You will go with me. Put your pistols in your belt and fetch my rifle. We may get some fresh meat among the hills." Breech-loading rifles had just come into fashion at that time, and the pirate captain had possessed himself of a double-barrelled one, with which he became wonderfully expert. This weapon was put into the boat with a large pouch full of cartridges. No comments were made in regard to this, the pirates having been accustomed to see their commander land in various places for a day's shooting, the result of which was usually an acceptable addition of fresh food to their larder. "Remain by the boat, lads, till we return," said Rosco, leaping out when the keel grated on the shore. "Come with me, Redford." The mate obeyed, following his commander towards the same ravine where, about 4 years before, they had seen poor Zeppa disappear among the recesses of the mountain. Redford felt a little surprise, and more than a little discomfort, at the peculiar conduct of his captain, but he comforted himself with the thought that if he should attempt any violence, there was a brace of pistols in his belt and a cutlass at his side. He even for a moment meditated using the pistols when he looked at Rosco's broad back, but he knew that some of the men in the boat had a sort of sneaking fondness for their captain, and refrained, at least till he should get out of sight of the boat and into the shelter of the woods, where his actions could not be seen, and any account of the affair might be coloured to suit his convenience. Richard Rosco divined pretty well what was passing in his mate's mind. He also knew that as long as they were in sight of the boat, his enemy would not dare injure him. He therefore threw his rifle carelessly over his shoulder, and walked with the most easy air of nonchalance over the strip of level land that lay between the sea and the forest that fringed the mountain base. On the instant of entering the mouth of the ravine, however, he wheeled suddenly round and said, "Now, Redford, you will lead the way, and I will direct you." The mate was startled, and his right hand moved, as if by involuntary impulse, towards the handle of a pistol. Instantly the muzzle of the captain's rifle was pointed at his breast. "Drop your hand," he said sternly. "Another such threat, and I will shoot you with as much indifference as I would a sneaking dog. Now go on, and do as I bid you." Redford gave in at once. He was at Rosco's mercy. Without a word he passed on in advance, and ascended the ravine with a quick steady step. To say the truth, he knew well that while his commander on the one hand would not threaten what he did not mean to perform, on the other hand he would not shed human blood needlessly. He therefore felt less troubled than might have been expected. They soon reached a small eminence or rocky plateau, from which was obtained a splendid view of the sea, with the bark floating like a large albatross on its surface. From that point the boat could also be clearly seen, and every step of the path by which they had reached the eminence. "Now, Redford," said Rosco, throwing his rifle into the hollow of his left arm, so as to bring the muzzle full on the mate's chest, while with the forefinger of his right hand he lightly touched the triggers, "draw your pistols from your belt, and be very careful how you do it, very careful, for if, even by chance, you touch your hammer or trigger, you are a dead man." There was something of banter in Rosco's manner, yet this was associated with an air and tone of such calm decision that the mate felt curiously uncomfortable. He obeyed orders, however, promptly, and stood with a pistol in each hand. It must have been a tantalizing position, for had they been cocked, he could have blown out Rosco's brains in a moment. Indeed, he was sorely tempted to break the half-cock catch on the chance of one or both going off, but his commander's eye and muzzle forbade it. "Drop them," said Rosco suddenly. If they had been red-hot irons, the mate could scarcely have let them go more quickly. It almost seemed as if his guilty desire had passed into the weapons and intensified the laws of gravitation. They came to the rock with such a clatter.
That will do. Now 2 paces step, back, march. Splendid! Why, Redford, I had no idea you was so well up in your drill," said Rosco, stepping to the spot beside the pistols, which the mate had just vacated. "You are fit to act fugleman to the British army. Now clasp your hands behind your back, and don't unclasp them till I give you leave. It is a new piece of drill, but not difficult to learn." The cowed pirate was too much alarmed to be amused by this last sally. He stood sulkily, it is true, but anxiously awaiting further orders. "Look here, Redford," continued the pirate captain, "I want to prove to you that the distance from this spot to the boat is about 500 yards. You see that gull on the water? It is about the same distance off as the boat. Well?" He sighted his rifle for 500 yards, took a rapid aim, fired, and the gull, leaping its own height out of the water, fell back dead. "Oh, don't start, my fine fellow! You forgot the other barrel." The reminder was in time to check an unwise impulse on the mate's part. "Now," continued Rosco, assuming a more serious tone, "I have brought you here for a last conversation. You have long desired to command that vessel, and I have long desired to resign the command. We shall both have our desires gratified this day. I intend to take up my abode here. You are free to go where you please, but not to come here again. Lay my words to heart now, and let me advise you to impress them on your crew. If you ever venture to come to this island again, I promise you to shoot every man that puts his foot upon the shore, and to shoot all that follow, as long as my ammunition lasts. And you see I have brought a pretty large bag of it on shore, which I do not mean to waste on gulls or anything else. I mean to keep it entirely for your benefit, my worthy friend. So, after this warning, you will please yourself and take your own course. Now go down to the boat, row straight back to your ship, tell your crew whatever you choose as to our interview, and go where you please. But bear in mind that my rifle will cover you during every step that you take from this spot down to the beach. Aye, and after you have left the beach too, until you are safe on board. Remember also that the rifle is sighted for 1,000 yards, and that the barque is not much further off than that. Go!" The last word was uttered in such a tone that Redford instantly turned, and without even a word of reply, retraced his steps to the shore. Then he promptly embarked, and the men promptly shoved off, while Rosco sat on the rocky eminence, quietly watching them. No words did Redford speak to his wandering men, except such as were needed to direct the boat. On gaining the vessel, he sprang up the side, ordered all sail to be set and the guns to be loaded. When the vessel had increased her distance a few hundred yards from the shore, he brought her broadside to bear on the land, and then, having carefully laid the guns, gave the word to fire. The hull of the pirate vessel was instantly enveloped in a snowy curtain of smoke, and next moment the echoes of the hills were rudely startled by a thunderous crash, while a dozen or more iron balls burst like bombshells on the cliffs immediately above the spot where Rosco sat, sending showers of rocks in all directions, and driving the sea mews in shrieking terror from their nests. "A mere waste of ammunition," murmured Rosco, with a contemptuous curl of his lips, as he rose. "But the next may be better aimed, so I'll bid you good bye, Redford." Descending into the ravine, he was soon safe from the iron messengers of death, of which the enraged Redford sent another group ashore before finally bidding the island farewell. Now it so happened that Zeppa was ascending the Sugar loaf Mountain on its other side when all this cannonading was going on. He was naturally surprised at such an unwonted sounds, and remembering that cannon implied ships, and that ships were necessary to deliverance from his enforced exile, he naturally hastened his steps, and experienced an unusual degree of excitement.
When he reached his favourite outlook, a ledge of flat land on the southern face of the hill, partially covered with bushes, he saw the pirate vessel sailing away from the island, and the smoke of her two broadsides rising like two snowy cloudlets into the blue sky. At first an expression of disappointment flitted across Zeppa's countenance, but it quickly passed, leaving the usual air of childlike submission behind. He sat down on a ledge of rock, and gazed long and wistfully at the retreating vessel. Then, casting his eyes upwards to the blue vault, he gave way to an impulse which had been growing upon him for some time. He began to pray aloud. It was while he was engaged in this act of devotion that Richard Rosco came upon the scene. At the first sound of the madman's deep voice, the pirate stopped, and listened with a feeling of superstitious dread which seemed to check the very action of his heart. For at the moment a few bushes concealed his old enemies from his sight. Stepping cautiously forward, he could see through the interlacing boughs without himself being seen, and then the blood forsook his visage, and his limbs trembled as if he had been a paralysed old man. Could the man before him, in tattered garments, with the dishevelled mass of flowing, curly, iron grey hair, with the long, heavy beard and moustache, the hollow cheeks, and the wonderfully solemn eyes, could that be Zeppa? It seemed impossible, yet there was no mistaking the well known and still handsome features, or the massive, sinewy frame. Still less was it possible to doubt the deep, sonorous voice. But then Zeppa had been seen on Ratinga Island, and the description given of him by those who had seen him had been so exact that Rosco had never doubted his return home and recovery of reason. Whatever he thought or felt, however, the pirate's whole being was soon absorbed in the madman's prayer. It was simple, like himself. He asked for permission to return home, and made a humble confession of sin. From the tenor of it, there could be no doubt that poor Zeppa had come to regard his exile as a direct punishment from God. Then the prayer changed to a petition for blessings on his wife and son, and the deep voice became deeper and full of tenderness. The pirate experienced a shock of surprise. Was the son, then, still alive? And if so, how came Zeppa to know? He could not know it. The man before him must either be the creature of his own disordered fancy, or a real visitant from the world of spirits. As these thoughts coursed like lightning through the pirate's brain, he was suddenly startled by the sound of his own name. "And Rosco," said the madman, still looking steadily up into the sky, while a dark frown slowly gathered on his brow. "O God, no, forgive me, Lord, and forgive him, and save him from his sins." He stopped abruptly there, and looked confused. The mention of the pirate and his sins seemed to remind the poor father that his son had been murdered, and yet somehow he had fancied him alive, and had been praying for him. He could not understand it at all. The old look of mingled perplexity and patient submission was beginning again to steal over his face, and his hand was in the familiar act of passing over the troubled brow, when Zeppa's eyes alighted on Rosco's countenance. It would be difficult to say which at that moment most resembled a maniac. The sight of his enemy did more, perhaps, to restore Zeppa to a spurious kind of sanity than anything that had occurred since the fatal day of his bereavement, and called up an expression of fierce indignation to his countenance. All memory of his previous prayer vanished, and he glared for a moment at the pirate with intense fury. At the same time Rosco stood with blanched cheeks, intense horror in his eyes, his lower jaw dropped, and his whole frame, as it were, transfixed. The inaction of both was, however, but momentary. The madman sprang up, clutched the heavy staff he was wont to use in climbing the hills, and rushed impetuously, but without word or cry, at his foe. The pirate, brave though he undoubtedly was, lost all self-control, and fled in abject terror. Fortunately the first part of the descent from the spot was unobstructed, for, in the then condition of their feelings, both men would probably have flung themselves over any precipice that had lain in their way. A few moments, however, sufficed to restore enough of self-possession to the pirate to enable him to direct his course with some intelligence. He naturally followed the path by which he had ascended, and soon gained the beach, closely followed by Zeppa. In speed the two men were at the time well matched, for any advantage that Zeppa had in point of size and strength was counterbalanced by the youth and superstitious terror of Rosco. At first, indeed, the madman gained on his foe, but as the impetuosity of his first dash abated, the pirate's courage returned, and, warming to the race, he held his ground. Like hare and greyhound, they coursed along the level patch of ground that lay on that side of the island, until they came in sight of the swampy land, covered with low but dense wood, which bounded the lands of Raturans. Dismay overwhelmed the pirate at the first sight of it. Then hope rebounded into his soul, and he put on a spurt which carried him considerably ahead of his pursuer. He reached the edge of the swamp land, and dashed into its dark recesses. He had barely entered it a few yards when he plunged into the water up to the neck. The heavy root of a tree chanced to hang over him. Drawing himself close beneath it, he remained quite still. It was his best, indeed his only chance. Next moment Zeppa plunged headlong into another part of the same half-hidden pool. Arising like some shaggy monster of the swamp, with weeds and slimy plants trailing from his locks, he paused a moment, as if to make sure of his direction before resuming the chase. At that moment he was completely in the power of the pirate, for his broad back was not more than a few feet from the screen of roots and tendrils by which Rosco was partially hidden. The temptation was strong. The pirate drew the keen knife that always hung at his girdle, but a feeling of pity induced him to hesitate. The delay sufficed to save Zeppa's life. Next moment he seized an overhanging branch, drew himself out of the swamp, and sped on his way. But having lost sight of his enemy, he soon paused and looked round with indecision. "It must have been a dream," he muttered, and began to retrace his steps with an air of humiliation, as if half ashamed of having given way to such excitement. From his hiding place the pirate saw him pass, and watched him out of sight. Then, clambering quickly out of the stagnant pool, he pushed deeper and deeper into the recesses of the morass, regardless of every danger except that of falling into the madman's hands. Chapter
9 of the Madman and the Pirate. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read and recorded by Betsy Bush in Marquette, Michigan, August 2007. The Madman and the Pirate by R.M. Ballantyne. Chapter 9. Who shall tell, or who shall understand, the thoughts of Richard Rosco, the ex-pirate, as he wandered lost, yet regardless, in this dismal swamp? The human spirit is essentially galvanic. It jumps like a grasshopper, bounds like a kangaroo. The greatest of men can only restrain it in a slight degree. The small men either have exasperating trouble with it, or make no attempt to curb it at all. It is a rebellious spirit. The best of books tells us that "greater is he that ruleth it than he that taketh a city." Think of that, youngster, whoever you are, who readeth this. Think of the conquerors of the world. Think of the great Alexander, whose might was so tremendous that he subjugated kingdoms and spent his life in doing little else. Think of Napoleon the Great, whose armies ravaged Europe from the Atlantic to Asia. who even began, though he failed to finish, the conquest of Africa, who made kings as you might make pasteboard men, and filled the civilized world with fear as well as with blood and graves, all for his own glorification. Think of these and other great men, and reflect that it is written, "He who rules his own spirit is greater than they." Yes, the human spirit is difficult to deal with, and uncomfortably explosive. At least, so Richard Roscoe found it when, towards the close of the day on which his enemy chased him into the dismal swamp, he sat down on a gnarled root and began to reflect. His spirit jumped almost out of him with contempt when he thought that for the first time in his life he had fled in abject terror from the face of man. He could not conceal that from himself, despite the excuse suggested by pride, that he had half believed Zeppa to be an apparition. What even if that were true? Had he not boastfully said more than once that he would defy the foul fiend himself if he should attempt to thwart him? Then his spirit bounded into a region of disappointed rage when he thought of the lost opportunity of stabbing his enemy to the heart. After that, unbidden, and in spite of him, it dropped into an abyss of something like fierce despair when he recalled the past, surveyed the present, and forecast the future. Truly, if hell ever does begin to men on earth, it began that day to the pirate. As he sat in the twilight on the gnarled root, with one of his feet dangling in the slimy water, his hands clasped so tight that the knuckles stood out white, and his eyes gazing upwards with an expression that seemed the very embodiment of woe. Then his spirit lost its spring, and he began to crawl, in memory, on the shores of other days. He thought of the days when, comparatively innocent, he rambled on the sunny hills of old England, played and did mischief with comrades, formed friendships and fought battles, and knew what it was to experience good impulses, understood the joy of giving way to these, as well as the depression consequent on resisting them, and recalled the time when he regarded his mother as the supreme judge in every case of difficulty, the only comforter in every time of sorrow. At this point his spirit grovelled like a crushed worm in the stagnant pool of his despair, for he had no hope. He had sinned every opportunity away. He had defied God and man, and nothing was left to him, apparently, save a fearful looking-for of judgment. As he bent over the pool he saw his own distorted visage dimly reflected therein, and the thought occurred, why not end it all at once? 5 minutes at the utmost, and all will be over. The pirate was a physically brave man beyond his fellows. He had courage to carry the idea into effect, but after death the judgment. Where had he heard those words? They were strange to him, but they were not new. Those who are trained in the knowledge of God's word are not, as a general rule, moved in an extraordinary degree by quotations from it. It is often otherwise with those who have had little of it instilled into them in youth and none in later years. That which may seem to be a Christian but a familiar part of the old story sometimes becomes to hundreds and thousands of human beings a startling revelation. It was so to the pirate on this occasion. The idea of judgment took such a hold of him that he shrank from death with far more fear than he ever had, with courage, faced it in days gone by. Trembling, terrified, abject, he sat there, incapable of consecutive thought or intelligent action. At last the gloom which had been slowly deepening over the swamp sank into absolute blackness, and the chills of night, which were particularly sharp in such places, began to tell upon him. But he did not dare to move, lest he should fall into the swamp. Slowly he extended himself on the root, wound his arms and fingers convulsively among leaves and branches, and held on like a drowning man. An ague fit seemed to have seized him, for he trembled violently in every limb, and as his exhausted spirit was about to lose itself in sleep, or, as it seemed to him, in death, he gave vent to a subdued cry, "God be merciful to me, a sinner!" Rest, such as it was, refreshed the pirate, and when the gray dawn, struggling through the dense foliage, awoke him, he rose up with a feeling of submissiveness which seemed, somehow, to restore his energy. He was without purpose, however, for he knew nothing of his surroundings, and of course could form no idea of what was best to be done. In these circumstances he rose with a strange sensation of helplessness, and wandered straight before him. And oh, how beautiful were the scenes presented to his vision! Everything in this world is relative. That which is hideous at one time is lovely at another. In the night, the evening, or at the gray dawn, the swamp was indeed dismal in the extreme. But when the morning advanced towards noon, all that was changed, as if magically, by the action of the sun. Black repulsive waters reflected patches of the bright blue sky, and every leaf and spray and parasite and tendril that grew in the world above was faithfully mirrored in the world below. Vistas of gnarled roots and graceful stems and drooping boughs were seen on right and left, before and behind, extending as if into infinite space, while innumerable insects, engaged in the business of their brief existence, were filling the region with miniature melodies. But Richard Rosco saw it not. At least it made no sensible impression on him. His mental retina was capable of receiving only two pictures: the concentrated accumulation of past sin, the terrible anticipation of future retribution. Between these two, present danger and suffering were well nigh forgotten. Towards noon, however, the sense of hunger began to oppress him. He allayed it with a few wild berries. Then fatigue began to tell, for walking from root to root, sometimes on short stretches of solid land, sometimes over soft mud, often knee-deep in water, was very exhausting. At last he came to what appeared to be the end of the swamp, and here he discovered a small patch of cultivated ground. The discovery awoke him to the necessity of caution, but he was awakened too late, for already had one of the Ratuian natives observed him advancing out of the swamp. Instantly he gave the alarm that a white face was approaching. Of course the appearance of one suggested a scout, and the speedy approach of a host. Horrified to see a supposed enemy come from a region which they had hitherto deemed their sure refuge, the few natives who dwelt there flew to arms and ran to meet the advancing foe. The pirate was not just then in a mood to resist. He had no weapon and no spirit left. He therefore suffered himself to be taken prisoner without a struggle, satisfied apparently to know that the madman was not one of those into whose hands he had fallen. Great was the rejoicing among the Ratuans when the prisoner was brought in, for they were still smarting under the humiliation of their defeat, and knew well that their discomfiture had been largely owing to the influence of white faces. True, they did not fall into the mistake of supposing that Rosco was the awful giant who had chased and belaboured them so unmercifully with a long stake, but they at once concluded that he was a comrade of Zeppa, perhaps one of a band who had joined their foes. Besides, whether he was a comrade or not was a matter of small moment. Sufficient for them that his face was white, that he belonged to a race which, in the person of Zeppa, had wrought them evil, and that he was now in their power. Of course the Ratuans had not during all these years remained in ignorance of the existence of Zeppa. They had heard of his dwelling in the mountain soon after he had visited the village of their enemies, and had also become aware of the fact that the white man was a madman and a giant. But more than this they did not know, because of their feud preventing interchange of visits, or of news between the tribes. Their imaginations, therefore, having full swing, had clothed Zeppa in some of the supposed attributions of a demigod. These attributes, however, the same imaginations quickly exchanged for those of a demi-devil, when at last they saw Zeppa in the flesh, and were put to flight by him. His size, indeed, had rather fallen short of their expectation, for 60 feet had been the average estimate, but his fury and aspect had come quite up to the mark, and the fact that not a man of the tribe had dared to stand before him was sufficient to convince a set of superstitious savages that he was a real devil in human guise. To have secured one of his minor comrades, therefore, was a splendid and unlooked-for piece of good fortune, which they resolved to make the most of by burning the pirate alive. Little did the wretched man think, when they conducted him to a hut in the middle of their village and supplied him with meat and drink, that this was a preliminary ceremony to the terrible end they proposed to make of him. It is true he did not feel easy in his mind, for, despite this touch of hospitality, his captors regarded him with looks of undisguised hatred. There was something of the feline spirit in these Raturans savages. As the cat plays with the mouse before killing it, so did they amuse themselves with the pirate before putting him to the final torture which was to terminate his life. And well was it for Rosco that they did so, for the delay thus caused was the means of saving his life, though he did not come out of the dread ordeal scatheless. They began with a dance, a war dance, it is to be presumed. At all events, it involved the flourishing of clubs and spears, the formation of hideous faces, and the perpetration of frightful grimaces, with bounds and yells enough to warrant the conclusion that the dance was not one of peace. Richard Rosco formed the centre of that dance, the sun, as it were, of the system round which the dusky host revolved. But he did not join in the celebration, for he was bound firmly to a stake set up in the ground, and could not move hand or foot. At first the warriors of the tribe moved round the pirate in a circle, stamping time slowly with their feet, while the women and children stood in a larger circle, making time with hands and voices. Presently the dance grew more furious, and ultimately attained to a pitch of wild violence which is quite indescribable. At the height of the paroxysm, a warrior would ever and anon dart out from the circle with whirling club, and bring it down as if on the prisoner's skull, but would turn it aside so deftly that it just grazed his ear and fell with a dull thud on the ground. Other warriors made at him with their spears, which they thrust with lightning speed at his naked breast, but checked them just as they touched the skin. 2 or 3 of these last were so inexpert that they pierced the skin slightly, and blood began to trickle down, but these clumsy warriors were instantly kicked from the circle of dancers, and compelled to take their place among the women and children. When they had exhausted themselves with the dance, the warriors sat down to feast upon viands, which had in the meanwhile been preparing for them, and while they feasted they taunted their prisoner with cowardice, and told him in graphic language of the horrors that yet awaited him. Fortunately for the miserable man, who was left bound to the stake during the feast, he did not understand a word of what was said. He had been stripped of all his clothing save a pair of short breeches, reaching a little below the knee, and his naked feet rested on a curious piece of basket-work. This last would have been too slight to bear his weight if he had not been almost suspended by the cords that bound him to the stake. Rosco was very pale. He felt that his doom was fixed, but his native courage did not forsake him. He braced himself to meet his fate like a man, and resolved to shut his eyes when next they began to dance round him, so that he should not shrink from the blow or thrust which he felt sure would ere long end his ill-spent life. But the time seemed to him terribly long, and while he hung there his mind began to recall the gloomy past. Perhaps it was a refinement of cruelty on the part of the savages that they gave him time to think, so that his courage might be reduced or overcome. If so, they were mistaken in their plan. The pirate showed no unusual sign of fear. Once he attempted to pray, but he found that almost impossible. Wearied at length with waiting, the savages arose, and began to put faggots and their combustibles under the wicker basket on which the pirate stood. Then, indeed, was Rosco's courage tried nearly to the uttermost, and when he saw the fire actually applied, he uttered a cry of "Help! Help!" so loud and terrible that his enemies fell back for a moment as if appalled. And help came, from a quarter that Rosco little expected. But to explain this we must return to Zeppa. We have said that he gave up the chase of the pirate under the impression that the whole affair was a dream, but on returning to his cave he found that he could not rest. Old associations and memories had been too violently aroused, and after spending a sleepless night he rose up, determined to resume the chase which he had abandoned. He returned to the spot where he had lost sight of his enemy in the swamp, and after a brief examination of the place, advanced in as straight a line as he could through the tangled and interlacing boughs. Naturally he followed the trail of the pirate, for the difficulties or peculiar formations of the ground which had influenced the latter in his course also affected Zeppa much in the same way. Thus it came to pass that when the Raturans were about to burn their prisoner alive, the Madman was close to their village. But Zeppa did not think of the Raturans. He had never seen or heard of them, except on the occasion of their attack on the mountain men. His sole desire was to be revenged on the slayer of his boy, and even in this matter the poor maniac was still greatly perplexed, for his Christian principles and his naturally gentle spirit forbade revenge on the one hand, while on the other a sense of justice told him that murder should not go unpunished, or the murderer remain at large, so that it required the absolute sight of Rosco before his eyes to rouse him to the pitch of fury necessary to hold him to the execution of his purpose. It was while he was advancing slowly and puzzling his brain over these considerations that Rosco's cry for help rang out. Zeppa recognized the voice, and a dark frown settled on his countenance as he stopped to listen. Then an appalling yell filled his ears. It was repeated again and again as the kindling flames licked round the pirate's naked feet, causing him to writhe in mortal agony. Instantly Zeppa was stirred to action. He replied with a tremendous shout. Well did the Raturans know that shout. With caught breath and blanched faces they turned towards the direction whence it came, and they saw the Madman bounding toward them with streaming locks and glaring eyes. A single look sufficed. The entire population of the village turned and fled. Next moment Zeppa rushed up to the stake and kicked the firebrands from beneath the poor victim, who was by that time almost insensible from agony and smoke. Drawing his knife, Zeppa cut the cords, and lifting the pirate in his arms, laid him on the ground. The Madman was terribly excited. He had been drenched from frequent immersions in the swamp, besides being much exhausted by his long and difficult walk, or rather scramble, after a sleepless night, and this sudden meeting with his worst enemy in such awful circumstances seemed to have produced an access of insanity, so that the pirate felt uncertain whether he had not been delivered from a horrible fate to fall into one perhaps not less terrible. As he lay there on his back, scorched, tormented with thirst, and helpless, he watched with fearful anxiety each motion of the Madman. For some moments Zeppa seemed undecided. He stood with heaving chest, expanding nostrils, and flaring eyes, gazing after the flying crew of natives. Then he turned sharply on the unhappy man who lay at his feet. "Get up," he said fiercely, "and follow me." "I cannot get up, Zeppa," replied the pirate in a faint voice. "Don't you see my feet are burnt? God help me!" He ended with a deep groan, and the ferocity at once left Zeppa's countenance, but the wild light did not leave his eyes, nor did he become less excited in his actions. "Come, I will carry you," he said. Stooping down quickly, he raised the pirate in his arms as if he had been a child, and bore him away. Avoiding the swamp, he proceeded in the direction of the mountain by another route, a route which ran so near to Ongoloo's village that the Raturans never ventured to use it. He passed the village without having been observed, and began to toil slowly up the steep ascent, panting as he went, for his mighty strength had been overtaxed and his helpless burden was heavy. "Lay me down and rest yourself," said Rosco with a groan that he could not suppress, for his scorched lower limbs caused him unutterable anguish, and beads of perspiration stood upon his brow, while a deadly pallor overspread his face. Zeppa spoke no word in reply. He did, indeed, look at the speaker once, uneasily, but took no notice of his request. Thus, clasping his enemy to his breast, he ascended the steep hill, struggling and stumbling upwards, as if with some fixed and stern purpose in view, until at last he gained the shelter of his mountain cave. Chapter 10.